Every morning after that first quiet act of kindness, Daniel's routine tightened around the small bench near the bus stop like a ritual he didn't realize he needed, because grief has a way of hollowing out time until habits become the only proof that days are still passing, and as the sky shifted from bruised purple to pale gold, he would arrive with Noah's small hand wrapped around his finger, the boy's backpack bouncing against his knees. And there she would be again, the same woman, same worn gray coat, same careful posture as if the world might crack if she leaned too hard into it, sitting with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on nothing in particular, and without a word Daniel would place the coffee beside her, sometimes a sandwich, sometimes a wrapped muffin he couldn't afford but bought anyway, telling himself it was just food, just spare change translated into calories, nothing more. Yet each time she nodded with that restrained gratitude, something tight in his chest loosened, as if the act itself was stitching him back together in ways he didn't fully understand, and Noah began to notice too, tugging at Daniel's sleeve and whispering questions about why the lady never smiled and whether she was cold and if they could give her his spare scarf, questions that Daniel answered softly, careful not to teach his son the kind of hardness he himself had learned too young. And over the weeks the woman's presence became as consistent as the sunrise, as if fate had scheduled her there just for him. And though they rarely spoke, the silence between them grew familiar, almost companionable, the kind of silence that doesn't demand explanations, and Daniel found himself lingering a few seconds longer each morning, adjusting the lid on her cup, straightening the napkin, small gestures that felt dangerously close to caring, because caring had once cost him everything, and yet he couldn't stop. Not when her hands shook as she lifted the coffee, not when he noticed the faint scar along her wrist that disappeared beneath her sleeve, not when one morning she surprised him by murmuring his name, Daniel, spoken like she'd tested it in her mouth before daring to release it, and he froze because he was certain he'd never told her, the world narrowing to that single sound, until she added quietly that Noah had said it once while laughing about pigeons stealing crumbs, and Daniel laughed too, relieved, unaware that she had been watching him far longer than he realized. Studying the way his shoulders curved inward like a man bracing against an invisible weight, the way his eyes softened only when he looked at his son, the way he flinched at sirens, and days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and the bench became an anchor point in Daniel's life, a place where his past didn't feel quite so heavy, until the morning everything shifted, the morning the woman wasn't there. The bench empty and glaring in its absence, and Daniel felt a panic that startled him. With its intensity, scanning the street, checking the shelter across the road, waiting longer than usual, his coffee cooling in his hand as Noah fidgeted, and when she still didn't appear, a sharp, unreasonable fear cut through him, the kind that whispers you don't deserve good things, that anything you grow attached to will be taken, and all day at work his mind drifted back to the empty bench, to the unfinished ritual. And the next morning when she finally returned, thinner, paler, eyes rimmed red, Daniel didn't think, he just asked if she was okay, the words tumbling out raw and unguarded, and she looked up at him with an expression that was almost pain, almost recognition, and said she had been sick, that hospitals made her remember things she'd rather forget, and something in her tone cracked open a door Daniel had kept locked for years, because hospitals did that to him too, and for the first time they talked. Not about names or pasts, but about how the smell of disinfectant could trigger memories, about how nights were louder than days, about how guilt could feel heavier than hunger, and as the weeks passed, their conversations deepened in small, careful steps, like people crossing thin ice, and Daniel began to notice strange details, like how she always asked about Noah's school but never about Daniel's job, how she listened with an intensity that bordered on study, how sometimes her eyes filled when Daniel mentioned his late wife, and though he never said it aloud, a part of him wondered why a woman living on a bench carried herself with such quiet dignity, such deliberate restraint, as if she were waiting for the right moment to stand, and that moment came one rainy morning when Noah was sick and Daniel came alone, rushing through the downpour, heart pounding at the thought of her sitting there cold and soaked, only to find her under the shelter, dry, composed, almost different, and she stood when she saw him, not in surprise but in resolve, and said softly that there was something he needed to know, something she should have told him from the beginning, because every kindness he had given her had been a thread pulling her closer to a truth she could no longer carry alone, and Daniel felt the old fear rise, the instinct to run, but he stayed, because some stories don't let you walk away, and as she took a breath, eyes locking onto his with a gravity that made his pulse roar in his ears, he realized that whatever she was about to say was tied to the past he had spent years trying to bury, the past that still haunted his sleep, the past that had shaped him into the man she saw every morning. And right before she spoke, right before the truth tipped forward, Daniel glanced at you, the unseen listener to his story, and if you felt that same weight, that same pull of unfinished truths and quiet kindnesses, stay with this story and subscribe, because what comes next will change everything he thought he knew about himself, about her, and about the past he believed was long gone. She stood there as the rain softened into a whisper against the pavement, and when she finally spoke her voice didn't shake the way Daniel expected, it carried the calm of someone who had already lived through the worst part of the storm, and she said her name was Evelyn, not because he needed to know it now but because it mattered to what came next, and then she told him that years ago, before the bus stop, before the bench, before the gray coat and the careful posture, she had been a social worker assigned to a case that changed her life forever, a case involving a young couple struggling under the weight of debt, exhaustion, and a newborn baby who cried more than slept, a couple whose names were Daniel and Laura, and the world tilted as Daniel felt his lungs forget how to work, the rain suddenly too loud, the air too thin, and Evelyn continued because stopping would destroy what little courage she had left, explaining how she had been the one who signed off on the investigation. After a neighbor reported shouting and broken glass, how she had watched Daniel sit in a stiff chair holding his infant son with hands that trembled not from anger but from fear of failing, how she had seen Laura's hollow eyes and recognized postpartum depression but had been overruled by supervisors who wanted quick resolutions and clean files, how one rushed decision led to another until the case closed with a warning instead of support, and weeks later Laura was gone, her death ruled an accident. A slip down the stairs no one could undo, and Daniel staggered back in time to that day, the phone call, the way the room had collapsed inward, the years he spent believing that if he had been stronger, more patient, less tired, she would still be alive, and Evelyn confessed that after the funeral she had attended anonymously, standing at the back, watching Daniel clutch his son like a lifeline, she quit her job, unable to carry the weight of what she believed was her failure, and her life unraveled slowly after that, sleep lost, savings drained, relationship severed, until she ended up on that bench, not by accident but by choice, because she needed to see whether the man she once judged through paperwork was truly the monster the system had implied, or the broken human she suspected he was. And every morning she watched Daniel show up with coffee and kindness not because anyone was forcing him but because it was who he was, and each small gesture chipped away at the lie Daniel had built inside himself, the lie that he was the reason Laura died, and as Evelyn spoke, tears finally came, heavy and unrestrained, because she said she had no right to forgiveness, she wasn't asking for it, she just couldn't let him keep living under a sentence he didn't deserve, and the silence that followed was so complete it felt sacred, and Daniel realized something astonishing, that the rage he expected wasn't there, that instead there was grief, yes, and sorrow, but also a strange release, like a door opening in a room he'd been locked inside for years. And he looked at Evelyn and saw not a villain but a woman crushed by a system that devours both sides of compassion, and he told her that he had spent years waking up every day believing he had failed the one person he loved most, that every smile from his son felt borrowed, undeserved, and when he spoke those words aloud they lost some of their power, and Noah's laughter echoed in his memory, bright and alive, proof that love could survive even the deepest fractures, and Daniel did something that surprised them both, he forgave her, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, because forgiveness, he realized, was not about absolution, but about freedom, and Evelyn broke down then, the kind of sobs that come from finally putting down a burden you've carried too long, and over the following weeks her life shifted too, a shelter referral, a counseling appointment, a job interview sparked by a former colleague who believed in second chances,